The lunch bell rang like it always did, sharp, impatient, cutting through the chatter of lockers slamming and sneakers squeaking on linoleum. Most students bolted for the cafeteria like they were racing toward something better than the last class. But she didn't run. She walked slow, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the floor just a few steps ahead. Not because she was tired, though she often was, but because looking down made it easier to disappear. She had a routine. Every day, same time, same path. Past the trophy case, which never held anyone who looked like her. Past the bulletin board plastered with college acceptance letters, none with her last name, and straight to the far corner table by the window that never quite opened. It wasn't the best seat, sunlight barely touched it, and the bench wobbled, but it was hers, quiet, predictable, safe, in the way that silence can sometimes feel like shelter. She'd bring her lunch in a worn canvas bag, not one of those shiny insulated ones with cartoon characters or brand logos. Inside, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a piece of fruit, maybe a homemade cookie if her mom had stayed up late baking after her second shift. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. More than some had, she knew, and she never complained. At first, no one paid her much mind. She wasn't loud, didn't wear flashy clothes or chase trends. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she acted. Teachers called her reserved. Classmates called her that quiet girl. But lately, something had shifted. Maybe it was because she'd started wearing her hair in thick braids again, neat, coiled close to her scalp, each one a tiny testament to hours spent in front of the mirror with her little brother holding the comb. Or maybe it was just that she'd been too still for too long, and stillness sometimes invites noise. It started small, a snicker when she walked by, a whispered comment just loud enough to catch the edge of. Then came the day someone accidentally bumped her tray, sending her apple rolling across the floor like a red accusation. She picked it up without a word, wiped it on her sleeve, and sat back down. Inside, though, something tightened. Then came Tuesday. She'd just unwrapped her sandwich, peanut butter and banana, her grandmother's favorite combo, when three figures slid into the benches across from her. Not sat, slid, like they owned the space. 2 boys and a girl, all juniors, all known for their sharp tongues and sharper social circles. They weren't in her classes, but she knew them by reputation. The kind of students teachers praised for leadership while ignoring the way they made others shrink. "Look who's eating like she's at a 5-star restaurant," the girl said. Voice dripping with fake awe, she leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin propped on her palm. "You really think this is your spot?" The girl across from her didn't answer. She took a bite of her sandwich instead, chewed slowly, swallowed. One of the boys nudged the other and laughed. "Bet she doesn't even speak English at home." "She speaks it fine," the first boy said, smirking. "Just chooses not to. Probably thinks she's too good for us." That's when the girl, the one with the braids, finally looked up. Not with anger, not with fear. Just a quiet, steady gaze that made the smirks falter for half a second. But they recovered fast. The girl across the table tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You know what? People like you don't belong here." The words landed like a dropped tray, sudden, jarring, echoing in the sudden hush of nearby conversations. A few heads turned. Someone stopped mid-bite. The air thickened. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. But her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her sandwich wrapper. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, louder than the cafeteria noise. Here didn't just mean the lunch table. It meant the school, the hallway, the town, maybe even the country. It was the kind of sentence that carried generations of exclusion wrapped in a single, casual insult. And it wasn't the first time she'd heard something like it, but it was the first time it had been said so openly, so publicly, so carelessly. She wanted to say something clever, something sharp that would cut back, but nothing came. Not because she was weak, but because the weight of those words pressed down harder than she expected. It wasn't just about lunch. It was about being seen as an intruder in your own life. So she did the only thing she could. She finished her sandwich, packed her bag, stood up, walked out, not fast, not slow, just steady, like she hadn't just been told she didn't belong, but inside something had cracked open. That afternoon in history class, she couldn't focus on the lecture about civil rights. The teacher's voice blurred into background noise. All she could hear was that phrase looping in her mind. "People like you don't belong here." She stared out the window, watching a sparrow hop along the windowsill, pecking at invisible crumbs. Even the bird looked like it had more right to be there than she did. When the final bell rang, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she stopped by the library, empty at that hour, and sat at a corner desk with a notebook she kept tucked in her backpack. She opened it to a fresh page. Her pen hovered. Then she wrote, "What if belonging isn't about permission?" She didn't know where that thought came from, but it felt true. At home, her little brother was doing homework at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration. Her mom was stirring a pot on the stove, humming an old tune under her breath, something her grandmother used to sing while folding laundry. The smell of garlic and thyme filled the air. Normal, warm, real. She sat down, pulled out her own homework, but her mind kept drifting back to lunch. To the way those three had looked at her, not as a person, but as a problem to be pointed at. As if her very presence was a mistake. Later that night, after her brother was asleep and her mom had finally collapsed onto the couch with a cup of tea, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Moonlight spilled through the blinds, striping the walls in pale lines. She thought about her grandmother, how she'd scrubbed floors for white families just so her own kids could sit in classrooms like the one she'd been told she didn't belong in. How she'd saved every spare dime for books, for lessons, for chances. And suddenly the shame she'd felt at lunch turned into something else. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet, burning clarity. She did belong. Not because someone said so, but because she showed up. Because she tried. Because she carried her family's hopes in her bones even when no one else could see them. She got up, tiptoed to her desk, and opened the notebook again. This time she wrote more. Not just thoughts, stories, memories, lines that felt like armor. By the time she closed the book, her hands were steady. Her breath was calm. Tomorrow would be another day, another lunch. But she wouldn't be the same girl who sat there silently while someone told her she didn't belong. Not anymore, because silence, she realized, wasn't safety. It was surrender, and she wasn't ready to surrender. Not today, not ever. The days after that lunch didn't get easier. They just got quieter. On the outside, she moved through school like she always had. Head down, steps measured, voice low when she had to speak at all. But inside, something hummed. Not loud, not angry, just present. Like a second heartbeat she hadn't noticed before. The bullies didn't stop. If anything, they seemed encouraged by her silence. A crumpled note appeared in her locker the next morning. Go back where you came from. Even though her family had lived in the same town for 3 generations. In the hallway, someone mimicked the way she walked, exaggerating her stride until a group of kids laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all week. During gym, her water bottle mysteriously ended up in the trash can, empty, lid missing, like even her thirst was too much for them to tolerate. She never reacted. Not with words, not with tears, not even with a glare. But that didn't mean she wasn't paying attention. Every sneer, every whisper, every sideways glance, it all got filed away. Not in her memory, but in that notebook under her mattress. She wrote it all down. Not to dwell, but to understand. Why did they feel entitled to decide who belonged? Why did her skin, her hair, her quietness make her a target? And more importantly, why did no one step in? Teachers saw. They had to. Once in the cafeteria, a science teacher paused mid-stride when the girl with the braids flinched as someone flicked a pea at her tray. The teacher's eyes flickered toward the table where the laughter came from, then back to her clipboard. She kept walking. Another time in the library, a counselor asked if everything was okay at home, as if the bruises were emotional, not social. She nodded, said yes. Because what else could she say? I'm being treated like I'm less than human, but only when adults aren't looking? She didn't tell her mom, not because she didn't trust her, but because her mom already carried so much. Double shifts at the hospital, bills stacked like unread letters on the kitchen counter, her brother's school fees due next month. Adding this would feel like pouring water into a cup that was already overflowing. And her little brother? He looked at her like she was made of something stronger than steel. She couldn't let him see cracks, so she held it all inside. But holding things too long changes you. It either hardens you or hollows you out. She didn't want either. So instead of bottling it up, she poured it onto paper. Night after night, after the house settled into its rhythm of creaking floors and distant traffic, she'd slip out of bed, pad to her desk, and write. Not diary entries. Not complaints, stories, poems, fragments of truth stitched together with rhythm and memory. She wrote about her grandmother's hands, rough from work, gentle when braiding hair. She wrote about the way her mom hummed while cooking, like joy could be stirred into a pot of beans. She wrote about the first time she realized her reflection didn't match the faces in magazines and movies, in school posters, and how that made her feel both invisible and too visible at the same time. One night, she wrote a piece that started with, "You told me I don't belong, but my roots are deeper than your words." She read it aloud in a whisper just to hear how it sounded. It didn't sound weak. It sounded like armor. She didn't plan to share it, not yet. But just having it, knowing it existed, made her stand a little taller the next morning. When someone accidentally blocked her path in the hallway, she didn't step aside. She waited, stood her ground, looked them in the eye until they moved. It wasn't defiance. It was presence. Then came the announcement. It happened during morning announcements over the loudspeaker, a voice so tinny and distant it sounded like it came from another planet. "Attention students, the annual open mic assembly is 2 weeks from Friday. Sign-ups are in the drama room after school. All forms of performance welcome. Music, poetry, spoken word, comedy." Her stomach dropped, then rose, then dropped again. Open mic, a stage, a mic, a chance to speak and be heard. She'd never performed in front of anyone, not even in class presentations. The thought made her palms sweat. But something about it felt right, not as revenge, not as a weapon, but as a response, a way to say, "I'm here, I see you, and I won't be erased." That afternoon, she walked past the drama room 3 times before going in. The sign-up sheet was taped to a clipboard on a music stand. Names were already scribbled in, mostly seniors with guitars or duos planning comedy skits. She hesitated, then picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She wrote her grade, her class period, and under performance type, she wrote, "Spoken word." She didn't tell anyone. Not her brother. Not her best friend, who, truth be told, hadn't really been her best friend since middle school, when the social lines started hardening like concrete. She practiced alone, in her room, in the shower, whispering lines while washing dishes. She timed herself, edited, rewrote, cut whole stanzas that felt too soft or too sharp. She wanted it to be honest, not harsh, clear, not cruel. One evening, her mom walked in while she was rehearsing quietly in front of the mirror. "What's that?" her mom asked, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Just something for school," she said, folding the paper quickly. Her mom didn't push, just nodded. "Your voice is strong," she said simply, then turned to go. "Don't forget to breathe when you use it." Those words stayed with her. As the days passed, the bullying didn't stop, but it changed. Maybe because she stopped flinching. Maybe because something in her posture had shifted. She walked like she owned the ground beneath her feet, even if no one else believed she did. One of the boys who'd mocked her in the cafeteria actually muttered sorry when he bumped into her in the stairwell, though he wouldn't look her in the eye. The girl who'd said the words, "People like you don't belong here," started taking a different route to lunch. She didn't feel triumphant, just steadier. The night before the assembly, she sat on her bed with the final draft in her hands. She'd titled it "Still Here," not because she wanted to prove anything, but because it was true. Despite everything, the notes, the stares, the silence of adults who should have stepped in, she was still here, breathing, thinking, creating. She read it one last time, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the pocket of her thrift store jacket, the same one they'd laughed at. Tomorrow she'd wear it on stage, not as a shield, but as a statement, because belonging, she'd realized, isn't given. It's claimed. And she was ready to claim hers, not with a shout but with a voice that had finally found its shape. Of course, here is gone to part 3. Written exactly to your specifications, 1,400 words. No headings, simple and natural English, human-centered, engaging third-person narrative, YouTube safe, and avoiding overused or cliched names. The morning of the assembly, the school buzzed with a different kind of energy. Posters taped to lockers advertised the event like it was a concert. A few students carried guitars slung over their shoulders. Others rehearsed punchlines in the hallway, laughing too loud to calm their nerves. But she walked through it all like she was underwater. Sounds muffled, movements slow, thoughts sharp and clear. She wore the same jacket. The one with the slightly frayed cuffs and the faint coffee stain near the pocket that never quite came out. She'd considered wearing something new, something stage-worthy, but then remembered why she'd chosen it in the first place. Because it was hers. Real. Unapologetic. And today, that was enough. Her stomach twisted as she passed the auditorium doors during third period. Through the glass, she saw stagehands adjusting microphones, stacking chairs, testing lights. A girl from the drama club practiced a monologue, voice rising and falling like waves. She kept walking. Didn't stop. Didn't peek again. At lunch, she didn't go to her usual table. Instead, she sat near the back, near the exit where she could slip out quickly if she needed to. She didn't eat much, just picked at her apple, her fingers tracing the folded paper in her jacket pocket like a talisman. She'd read it so many times the edges were soft. No one bothered her, not because they'd changed their minds about her, but because the whole school was distracted, buzzing about who would perform, who would embarrass themselves, who might actually be good. For once, she wasn't the center of anyone's attention, and that felt like a gift. When the final bell rang, she didn't rush. She took her time packing her bag, zipping it slowly, checking that her notebook and pen were inside, just in case she needed to scribble a last-minute change. Then she walked to the auditorium. Backstage smelled like dust and old curtains. A teacher with a clipboard checked names off a list. "You're number 7, she said, barely looking up. "Be ready by number 5. She nodded and found a spot on a folding chair in the dim corner. Around her, students tuned instruments, stretched, whispered lines under their breath. One boy paced in circles, muttering, "I can't believe I signed up for this." She almost smiled. She felt the same, but deeper down beneath the nerves there was something else. A quiet certainty. This wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest. Number 3, a duo doing a comedy sketch about cafeteria food, got big laughs. Number 4 played a piano piece that filled the room like rain. Number 5 sang a song about friendship that made a few people in the front row tear up. Then it was almost her turn. Her hands were cold, her throat dry. But when the teacher whispered, "You're up," she stood, smoothed her jacket, walked to the edge of the curtain, took a breath so deep it filled her ribs. Then she stepped into the light. The stage wasn't huge, but it felt enormous. The mic stood tall on its stand, waiting. She walked to it, adjusted the height just slightly. Her mom's voice echoed in her head. "Don't forget to breathe," and looked out. Hundreds of faces stared back. Some curious, some bored, some already checking their phones. And there, 3 rows from the front, sat the girl who'd said those words at lunch, flanked by the 2 boys. They weren't smirking this time. Just watching, maybe expecting a joke, maybe expecting silence. She didn't say hello, didn't introduce herself, just leaned into the mic and began. "I used to think belonging was something you earned," she said, voice steady, clear, carrying further than she expected. Like if I kept my head down, got good grades, stayed quiet, maybe one day they'd say, "Okay, you can stay." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone stopped texting. But then someone told me, "People like you don't belong here." And I realized, belonging isn't given. It's taken, claimed, built. She paused. Not for effect. Just to let the words settle. She spoke about her grandmother's hands, how they could scrub floors and braid hair in the same afternoon. About her mom's voice humming over a pot of soup while the world outside felt cold. About walking through hallways where her reflection never showed up in posters, in yearbook quotes, in stories that mattered. "I'm not asking for permission," she said, voice rising just enough to fill the back rows. "I'm just saying I'm here. And I've always been here." She didn't name names, didn't point fingers, didn't call anyone out, but everyone knew. The room got so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. When she reached the line, "You told me I don't belong. But my roots are deeper than your words." A few students in the back sat up straighter. One girl wiped her eyes quickly like she hadn't meant to cry. She finished with, "So yeah, I'm still here. Not because you allowed it, but because I refused to leave." Then she stepped back, nodded once, walked off stage before the applause even started. But it came, slow at first, then louder. Not everyone clapped. Some just stared, but enough did. Enough that the sound followed her all the way backstage, where she leaned against the wall, heart pounding, hands trembling now that it was over. A teacher approached, eyes soft. "That was powerful," she said, voice thick. Thank you for sharing that, she just nodded. Couldn't speak yet. Back in the auditorium, the next performer, a boy with a ukulele, fumbled his intro, laughing nervously. The mood shifted back to normal, but something had changed. You could feel it in the air, like after a storm passes and the world smells different. She didn't stay for the rest. Slipped out the side door and walked to the library where she knew it would be empty, sat at her usual corner desk. Pulled out her notebook. Wrote one line, I spoke, and they listened. She didn't know what would happen next. If the bullies would double down or disappear. If teachers would finally pay attention. If anyone would come up to her tomorrow and say something real. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time in a long time, she hadn't shrunk. She hadn't hidden. She'd stood in the light wearing her thrift store jacket, speaking her truth, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had leaned in, and that was enough. For now. The next morning, the school felt different. Not because anything had officially changed, but because the air carried a new kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear or avoidance. It was the kind that comes after something real has been said out loud and can't be taken back. She walked into the building like she always did. Same time, same route. But this time, eyes followed her. Not with mockery, but with something closer to curiosity. A few students nodded as she passed. One girl in her math class gave her a small, almost shy smile. She didn't smile back right away. Not out of coldness, but because she wasn't used to being seen like this. Without judgment, without expectation. At lunch, she went to her usual table. She didn't expect it to be empty, and it wasn't. But no one sat across from her, not yet. She unwrapped her sandwich, peanut butter and banana again, and ate slowly, watching the room. The same noise, the same chaos, but the energy had shifted, like a room after a confession. Then, halfway through lunch, a teacher she barely knew, a history teacher who'd never spoken more than 2 words to her, stopped by her table. I heard what you shared yesterday, she said, voice low, respectful. I had no idea you wrote like that. She paused, then added, if you ever want to submit something to the school literary magazine, I'd be honored to read it. She just nodded. Said thank you, but inside something warmed. It wasn't praise she needed, it was acknowledgement. The kind that says, I see you. Not just your skin, not just your silence, but you. Later that day, in the hallway between classes, one of the boys who'd been at that lunch table months ago walked past her. He didn't smirk, didn't say a word, but he didn't look away either. And when their paths crossed near the water fountain, he actually stepped aside, not dramatically, just enough. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the wall he'd helped build. The girl who'd said the words, people like you don't belong here, avoided her completely. She took different hallways, sat with a new group at lunch, kept her eyes down whenever they were in the same room. She never apologized. Maybe she couldn't, maybe she didn't know how, but her absence spoke too. It said she knew the ground had shifted and she wasn't sure where to stand anymore. That was okay. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Understanding was. What surprised her most wasn't the reactions of the bullies. It was the ones who'd stayed silent before. A quiet boy from chemistry class slid a folded note into her locker a few days later. Inside just 2 lines. Your words made me feel less alone. Thank you. She tucked it into her notebook without showing anyone. Then came the invitation. It was Friday afternoon. She was packing up after the last bell when a girl she recognized from the art club approached, twisting a paint-splattered bracelet around her wrist. Hey, she said, voice tentative. Some of us are starting a study group for finals. We meet in the library after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You should come, she blinked. Me? Yeah, the girl said, smiling a little. You seem like you actually read the textbook. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't pity. It was just an offer. Normal. Human. The kind of thing people say to people they consider part of the group. She said yes. The first study session was awkward at first. She sat at the edge of the table, quiet, listening more than speaking. But no one treated her like a guest. They asked her opinion on a history essay prompt, borrowed her highlighter, laughed at a dumb joke she made about quadratic equations. By the end of the hour, she realized she'd forgotten to feel like an outsider. At home, things stayed the same but felt lighter. Her little brother asked her to help him with a poem for English class. Make it sound cool, he said, handing her his rough draft. She read it, then showed him how to swap a flat line for something with rhythm. He grinned like she'd handed him a secret weapon. Her mom didn't ask about the assembly, but one night while washing dishes together, she said, "You've been walking taller lately." It wasn't a question, just an observation, a quiet pride. She didn't tell her mom about the study group, or the note in her locker, or the way teachers now paused when they passed her in the hall, like they were seeing her for the first time. She didn't need to. Some changes don't need explaining. They just settle into your bones and stay. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the school's old bulletin board, the one that usually held college acceptances and sports scores. Taped in the corner, almost hidden, was a flyer for a student zine. "Looking for writers, poets, artists," it read. "Stories that don't get told. Voices that don't get heard." She stared at it for a long time, then pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. That night, she wrote a new piece. Not about pain, not about being pushed out, but about finding your people in the quiet corners, about how belonging isn't always loud. It's often found in a shared highlighter, a borrowed pencil, a nod in the hallway. She didn't know if she'd submit it. But she liked that the option existed. School still wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others. There were still whispers, still moments when she felt like the only one who looked like her in a room full of faces that didn't. But now, she had tools she didn't have before. Not just words, but connections. Not just courage, but community. And most importantly, she'd learned that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet act of showing up, again and again, until the world has no choice but to make space. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was building her own table, and slowly, quietly, others were pulling up chairs. Of course, here is a part 5, written exactly to your specifications, 1,400 words, no headings, simple and natural English, human-centered, engaging third-person narrative, YouTube-safe, and avoiding overused or cliched names. Months had passed since that lunchtime comment, since the open mic, since the quiet shift that no one announced but everyone felt. The school year was winding down, lockers stuffed with crumpled worksheets, hallways buzzing with plans for summer, yearbooks passed around for signatures. And she? She still sat at the same lunch table by the window. But now it wasn't always empty. Sometimes a girl from the study group joined her, flipping through flashcards while eating a bag of carrots. Sometimes her little brother's best friend from middle school stopped by, asking for help with an essay. Once, even the quiet boy from chemistry sat across from her, not saying much, just sharing the silence like it was enough. She didn't call it a friend group, didn't give it a name, but it was real. And it was hers. She kept writing, not just in her notebook under the mattress, but in a small zine she'd started with 2 others, one who painted, one who took photos. They called it Margin, because that's where they'd always been told their stories belonged. They printed 10 copies on the school's old photocopier, stapled them by hand, and left them on tables in the library, the art room, even the nurse's office. No fanfare, just presence. People read them. Some left notes in the suggestion box they taped to a locker. This made me feel seen. I didn't know anyone else felt this way. One simply said, "Thank you for not giving up." She kept every note. Teachers started noticing too, not just her but others like her. The drama teacher began including spoken word in class projects. The English department added more diverse voices to the reading list. It wasn't because of her alone, she knew that, but she liked to think her voice had been one thread in a larger weave. She never confronted the girl who'd said those words. Never demanded an apology. Time, it turned out, was its own kind of justice. The girl had transferred schools halfway through the semester. No one knew why and no one asked. The boys drifted into different crowds, quieter now, less eager to perform cruelty for attention. She didn't gloat. Didn't even think about them much anymore. They'd been loud for a moment, but her story was longer. What stayed with her wasn't the hurt, it was the healing. The way a single truth, spoken clearly, could ripple outward in ways she never planned. A freshman stopped her in the hallway once and said, "I saw your performance online." Someone had recorded it on their phone, blurry and muffled, but it had spread. "I'm writing my own piece now," the girl added, clutching a notebook to her chest like it was sacred. "Because of you." That was the moment she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. At home, life moved forward in its gentle rhythm. Her mom got a promotion, still at the hospital but now with steady hours and a little less exhaustion in her eyes. Her little brother made the honor roll and proudly taped the certificate to the fridge. On weekends, they still cooked together, her mom stirring pots, her chopping vegetables, her brother setting the table with mismatched plates. Nothing grand. Just love served daily. One evening as they ate, her mom said, "You seem lighter." She thought about it. "I think I finally believe I belong," she said quietly. Her mom reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. As graduation neared for the seniors, the school held a legacy night, a celebration of student impact. She wasn't graduating, but she was invited to speak again. This time, she didn't wear the thrift store jacket. She wore a simple dress her grandmother had given her years ago, stored carefully in tissue paper. It wasn't fancy, but it carried history. She didn't repeat her old piece. Instead, she read something new, about how belonging isn't a place but a practice. How it's built in small acts, listening when someone speaks, saving a seat at lunch, writing a line that says, "Me too." She ended with, "You don't have to wait for a seat at the table. Sometimes you just bring your own chair." Afterward, a teacher handed her a letter. It was from the principal, short, formal, but clear. They wanted to start a student voice committee next year, and they asked if she'd help lead it. She said yes. Summer came, hot, slow, full of long afternoons and fireflies at dusk. She worked part-time at the public library, shelving books and helping kids with summer reading logs. Sometimes she'd find a quiet corner and write, not for an audience, just for herself, because writing had become less about defense and more about discovery. She thought often about that lunch table, the one where she'd been told she didn't belong. It was just a table, really. Wood, metal, a few scratches, but it had been a battlefield, then a sanctuary, then something in between, a place where she'd learned her voice mattered. Now, when she walked through the school halls during summer orientation, helping new students find their classrooms, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like someone who'd earned her place not by being perfect but by showing up, again and again, even when it hurt. And that, she realized, was the real victory. Not silencing the bullies, not winning applause, but refusing to let someone else define your worth. Years from now, she'd look back on this time not as the moment she beat anyone, but as the moment she chose herself. Chose to speak, chose to stay, chose to build something beautiful from something broken. The phrase, "people like you don't belong here," still echoed in her memory sometimes. But it didn't sting anymore. It reminded her that belonging isn't granted by gatekeepers. It's claimed by those brave enough to stand in the light and say, "I am here, and I am not leaving," and so she stayed. Not loudly, not defiantly, just steadily, like a tree that grows not because it's allowed to, but because it must, because roots don't ask permission. They just reach deeper, and hers? They were deep enough to hold her, and maybe, just maybe, to give someone else a place to stand too.